Hello everyone. Welcome to Chacruna Institute's live weekly community forum. My name is Emily Williams, and I am the operations manager here at Chacruna. Thank you all so much for joining us. Today we have invited wonderful, renowned author Michael Pollan in conversation with our executive director, Dr. Bia Labate, and they're going to be discussing a conversation on plants and talking a little bit about his new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants. I'm really looking forward to hearing this discussion. I read Michael's book that was published in 2018, and it really gave me, the almost permission to pursue a career in psychedelics. So thank you so much, Michael, for inspiring me. I will go over a few logistics of today's events, do a couple announcements, and then I am going to invite our COO, Josh Meadow, onto the stage, and he will talk a little bit about Chacruna and about today's event. So as you can notice on your screen, we have a live chat. We encourage you all to use the chat throughout the today's discussion. Please keep it relevant and respectful and not overly self-promotional. I'm calling in from Norman, Oklahoma, and we would like to invite you all to post where you're calling in from. I can see many of you already have. We have some people from Long Beach, from Tucson, Arizona, Arkansas, beautiful area in our country. I love going to shows in Arkansas. Seattle, it's really cool to see how far our community reaches, and it's great to connect with everyone around the world. In today's discussion, Bia and Michael will chat for about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll leave the last 30 minutes for Q&A. So make sure to click that Ask a Question button at the bottom of your page and post your questions that come up throughout today's event. And then as those questions come in, you can upvote your favorite. I have a feeling we'll probably have lots of questions, and we will do our very best to get to all of them. But if we can't, we will definitely get to the upvoted ones first. So keep an eye out on those throughout the discussion today. If you'd like to access today's recording or any other of the past recordings, you can do so through our Crowdcast link. We have lots of past community forums with really cool topics and great speakers, so I encourage you to check those out. For those of you who are not aware, Chacruna is a small grassroots nonprofit, and it is our mission to provide public education and cultural understanding around psychedelic plant medicines and to promote that bridge between the ceremonial use of plant medicines and psychedelic science. If you'd like to support our work and to ensure that we can keep doing these great forums and having these wonderful speakers and keep educating the public, please check out our Patreon page. Different memberships include all sorts of different perks and discounts on conferences, on forums such as these. And it's really, it's a beautiful way to show your support for us and to, like I said, ensure that we can keep doing this. Let's see, next week's event is going to be on Wednesday, November 24th at 12 p.m. Pacific time, and it's going to be over the topic Latinos Coast to Coast, Taínos Talk Plant Medicine, and have that posted on Crowdcast. My video's glitching out a little bit, so I hope my audio isn't. Weird. No, cancel.
I'm going to pop on because I think Emily is having some technical issues, but I think she was going to pass it over to me in a moment anyway. So hi, everyone. My name is Josh Meadow. I'm the COO for Chacruna. I'm so excited to be here introducing today's event. I'm calling in from San Francisco, traditionally Ohlone territory. And I'm just going to share a little more about us and introduce Michael and Bia. So, as Emily mentioned, our work is about building a bridge between these different worlds in the psychedelic space, the kind of ceremonial, shamanic, ritual religion world of indigenous culture and tradition and plant medicine, and the mainstream psychedelic science. And so we take a very intersectional sort of focus, and people who get into psychedelics, I think, really see that how intersectional they are. They really tap into science, but also culture, history, anthropology, religion, identity, philosophy, all these different law, policy, all these different things. And so we really try to have all those conversations and tap into those different subjects and areas that maybe some of the mainstream conversation is not tapping into. And so we do that through our articles and through these events, our conferences, and other stuff like that. So if you're interested in some of those deeper subjects and going into some of these other issues that are maybe more traditionally kind of on the sidelines of the mainstream conversation, I really encourage you to check out our work. And I say that because I also think that Michael Pollan's work is very much in that vein, in that it's very intersectional and taps into so many different areas and brings them all together to create just such compelling stories and books. So I've been a huge fan of Michael Pollan actually since high school, when he spoke at my high school in like 2005, 2006. This was years before he started writing about psychedelics, but I became a fan very early on, and then went back and read earlier stuff like Botany of Desire. And so when he started writing about psychedelics, I think 2015 was when he wrote this piece for the New Yorker, the trip treatment. I had a sense, I knew actually, I told my dad when I read that piece that he was probably going to write a book on psychedelics. And of course he did. And I remember some people felt like it was this departure. If they didn't know his work so well, maybe they thought of him as this food systems kind of guy. It seemed like this big departure for him to get into psychedelics. But really, if you were familiar with his work and had gone back and read things like Botany of Desire, you would see that there is this clear thread there, I think. And it really, the thread really for me in his work is plants, and really this relationship between humans and plants or fungi and kind of the natural world. And that is something, he really explores in almost all of his work. And I think this most recent book, This Is Your Mind on Plants, really kind of brings that full circle and makes that connection very clear. And I love that it starts with this piece on opium that he wrote, I think, in 1996. So it's such even though it's not specifically about psychedelics, it's about drugs, it's about plants, it's about the drug war and policy, and this incredible sort of satire critique of the drug war. And so it really shows that he has been interested in these things for a long time. And it's great. I'm such a huge fan. There's so much I could say about Michael Pollan, but yeah, I want to leave time for Bia and Michael's conversation. But I'm very, very excited for this. I encourage everyone to check out Chacruna's work, check out Michael Pollan's work, of course. And thank you so much for joining us. I'll pass it over to Bia.
Hi, Michael. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
See,
how are you?
I am good. We have made a lot of compliments so that I can ask a lot of hard questions. No, just kidding. We're not. I'm not going to be the bad cop.
Hard as you want.
Our team is your fan. And yeah, we also have questions that we think the psychedelic community want to ask you. I just want to preface by saying that I think I met you in 2016 or something like that. And for everybody, Michael has been always a true gentleman and colleague. I gave him a few interviews and uh, articles, recommended readings, visited his beautiful house in Berkeley with a view of the entire bay, which is magnificent and causes an impression on my Brazilian brain. And to me, there is a nice biographical meeting here because Michael has also been a witness to my attempts to move to the United States and start Chacruna. Uh, so I like to tell him about my progress once in a while. And he has been nice and cordial and also giving a lot of stimulation, including he gave us out of the blue 500 in our end of the year campaign, which I thought was a nice gesture. Uh, so thanks for that, Michael, for your friendship and
Well,
your.
I owe you in many ways. I've learned a lot from you, especially when I started paying more attention to the indigenous uses and traditional uses of psychedelics. And I don't know if you read the acknowledgments to my latest book, but your name is there, and I
Yes,
expressed my gratitude.
yeah, I appreciate it, and I also felt excited to see you going into what I think is the more exciting part of this movement. But then again, I'm highly biased, which is to talk more about culture and plants and traditions, and not so much just the therapies and the science. So that was the book that Michael was referencing, is our book on peyote, and I think. There is this other one that I don't know. I think I forgot to tell you, but it's this prohibition, religious freedom, and human rights regulating traditional drug use. And I feel that your book is very aligned with this one, which is talking about traditional uses of plants or cacti, fungi that exist in certain contexts. And when you try to migrate it to the West and to our regulation regimes, it doesn't quite fit. And it talks about this mixture of plants and foods and nutrition and healing and socialization, celebration, how plants are used traditionally in different contexts. You have the case of cat, the case of kratom, the case of ayahuasca, the case of peyote, and it doesn't quite fit the system of schedules and the ways we classify drugs. So I think this recent work is very aligned with my own interests and um, my our concerns as anthropologists. So I would perhaps just start by asking you, can you talk a little bit about this general idea of how it's hard to differentiate sometimes foods and drugs and uh, drugs and foods and medicine, and this kind of general overarching division of how we
Yeah,
classify
well,
it.
it's a real characteristic of the Western mind to divide things neatly into categories, and the line between food and drugs is very difficult to define. If a drug is something that you ingest that changes you, well, that's true of a great many foods as well. And I posed the question at the beginning of the book: is chicken soup a drug? Makes people feel better. It helps them get over their colds, but it's also a food. Is a placebo a drug? It's something you ingest that changes you, but for reasons that are totally in your head. And then you have these cultural differences. The use of entheogens in various cultures. Some are used. The same entheogen can be used sacramentally, used for divination, used for healing. And the line between, a sacramental use and a medicinal use doesn't exist, because it depends on how you define health. And if you define health as a spiritual problem, then you'll try to treat it in a spiritual way. So I think it is a basic awkwardness. And, fortunately, the medicinal path, the Western therapeutic path, is not the only path that plant medicines are on, and I don't see it as being the only way in which they will get approved or be accepted for use. I do think that you know, I mean, there are 2 ayahuasca churches in America, and there's the Native American church, and those are very interesting models, different models on how psychedelics could enter American culture. And I think there'll be a great many other churches in the future that use, you know, that involve plant medicines.
Yeah, interesting. And I think a lot of people were seeing you as like a, you know, white man that is more interested in the science and was studying the mainstreaming of the psychedelic renaissance. And what this book brings, Emily, you're back on by accident.
Yeah, I'm closing off. I had to reload the page. Excuse me.
What this book, as Josh said, seems to unite a little bit the parts of you that maybe not everybody that got to know you through your
How to
recent
change your mind. Yeah, but that was, I mean, I was always interested in traditional use of these drugs, and you know, I've written about it before, but I also understood I'm writing for a general audience. I'm not writing for people in the psychedelic community, first and foremost. And in America right now, the most authoritative lens that you can bring to any phenomenon is the science lens, for better or worse. It's just a reality. If you want to get people to take something seriously, and I was trying in How to Change Your Mind to get people to take psychedelics seriously, the discourse that you rely on is bound to be scientific. And it is indeed the findings of these, you know, mostly white Western male scientists that have elevated psychedelics into a subject and a therapy that's taken very seriously. But I knew the whole time I was writing that book that I was overlooking a very important part. And although I did talk about ayahuasca briefly and had 2 ceremonies and it explored it, for reasons of length and reasons of authority, credibility, you know, I leaned heavily on the science. Plus, I was fascinated by it. I mean, I think the science is really, really interesting, but it's clearly not the whole story. And I was really happy to have an opportunity to tell a very different kind of story in This Is Your Mind on Plants. And the 3rd section of that book is all about peyote and the Native American church. And that is just a completely different model of healing, of religion, of you know, use of a psychedelic. And it raises all these complicated questions of cultural appropriation and who has the right to use these plants. And I was, you know, kind of thrilled to get to delve into that because it's such a complex story.
Yeah, and I was starting my question, but you jumped in, but I meant to finish it by saying that perhaps people that were thinking that they hadn't read The Botany of Desire, so maybe they thought it was a weird loop. But if they had read it, they would see more the continuity throughout. And also something that you mentioned in this book more clearly that you don't get to know like just by watching the author is that in fact you're a gardener and you like gardening. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, oh, always happy to talk about gardening. So all my work begins in the garden. I mean, that is the origin, the wellspring of my interest. Beginning in the 1980s, I was working in New York City as a magazine editor at Harper's Magazine, and that was my day job. We started going to, we bought this country house in Cornwall, Connecticut, about 2 hours from New York. And it was this falling apart 5-acre chunk of an old dairy farm that was defunct. And I started gardening in a really serious way. And I spent every moment I could up there learning how to garden. And I ran into all sorts of problems as the novice garden does. I had woodchucks, also known as groundhogs, that were eating my crops. I had problems with insects. I had problems with soil fertility. And I realized at some point, and it was a very precise point where I got into this kind of embarrassing war with a woodchuck that was destroying my garden. And I did some things I'm not proud of to eliminate him. I realized that the drama of the human relationship to other species in the natural world plays out in our backyards, plays out in our gardens, and that instead of going to the wilderness, which is where Americans normally go to think about their relationship to nature, they go to the desert, they go to the woods, they go to the Grand Canyon, whatever it is. They go to untouched places, or supposedly untouched places. And generally, they're not so untouched as we like to think. I realized the garden was a really rich place to explore this relationship. And it was better in many ways because we had no choice but to alter nature in the garden, because you're there to grow some food, to grow some beautiful flowers, to create a wonderful habitat for yourself. So you're going to change nature, but there are good and bad ways to do that. And very complex moral and ethical issues come up. So I started writing essays about what was happening in my garden, my relationship to other species, whether they were pests or the plants I was hoping to grow. And I have found this world, the world of plants and our relationship to it, to consume my interest now for 40 years. It's a big part of what I think about every day. And I've been looking at our relationship to plants in several different contexts. The most obvious, and the one that most people knew me for before How to Change Your Mind, was food. I mean, one of the most important things we use plants for is to nourish ourselves. And agriculture represents the way we change nature more than anything else we do. Whether you're talking about the composition of species on the planet, or you're talking about the reconfiguring of the landscape, or even the atmosphere, because agriculture and our eating habits contributes an enormous amount to our carbon footprint. So I spent 4 books thinking about the food system and how our relationship to other species, including animal species, has been so distorted by the industrial food system. But I was always interested in the fact that food was not the only thing we use plants for. And a really interesting, and to my mind, curious use of plants is to change consciousness. And that struck me as such an interesting phenomenon, because it's not obvious why it would be adaptive. Of course we evolved to eat plants. We need to. But why did we evolve to use plant medicines? And answering that question has been very interesting to me. I mean, if you think about it, if you use something that changes your consciousness, yes, it might be helpful to relieve pain or relieve boredom. Those are kind of good uses that I suppose natural selection would support. But when you take a powerful psychoactive, you are more vulnerable, right? You're more likely to have accidents. You're discombobulated in various ways. It seems like a dangerous thing to do from an evolutionary point of view. Yet natural selection has not eliminated the drug takers. So there must be some value to it. And that's one of the questions I began to explore. And I think the values are healing, novelty, the introduction of novel ideas and metaphors and insights that come with plant medicines, not always, but often. And that, very important memes or cultural ideas have come into human culture via psychedelics. It's very hard to prove precisely which ones. We have the testimony of great scientists who made discoveries on psychedelics. There's a whole theory around this idea of psychedelic visions at the birth of religions, and of philosophical ideas of Platonism and things like that. So that's a kind of enduring fascination I've had. And as you said, I did write about plant medicines in the form of cannabis in Botany of Desire, and then I wrote this piece on opium. Growing my own opium, which was a garden piece / drug war parable that I'm republishing in this book in its uncensored form. Because when I published it in Harper's in 1997, it was at the height of the drug war, and I was essentially confessing to federal crimes in a way that the lawyers thought was very dangerous. So I ended up having to cut sections from that piece, and I always regretted that. So now I had an opportunity to restore that piece to its original shape. But yeah, I go way back with plants and way back with plant medicines. Although I don't know that I used that term back then. I don't think it was as familiar. And again, even the term plant medicine doesn't capture the full meaning of these plants.
Yes, so
medicine is only one thing they do.
Yeah, people can spend a lot of hours trying to define psychedelics or plant medicine, sacred plants, entheogens, and those conversations perhaps endless. And there's advantages and disadvantages to all the terms. But I want to go back again to a more general, broad topic that is in botany of desire, and that you mentioned en passant, which is this relationship between human and plants, and the kind of, we have this vision that there's nature and then there's us, but actually it's more complicated than that, because what we think sometimes is nature, it has already been domesticated by us thousands of years away, to a point that you can't really dissociate where one starts and when the other ends. So can you talk a little bit about the mutual relationship?
Sure. All nature culture dualities are myths, right? I mean, first of all, to put nature over here and us over here doesn't make any sense, because we are animals. We are part of nature. Yet we insist on separating ourselves from nature. I think that's a very interesting human trait. We somehow want to put ourselves above or outside the natural world. I mean, think of it. We speak of having a relationship to nature. What other creature has a relationship to nature? They just are nature. But we sense somehow an alienation, that we have one foot in, one foot out. And then you take things like the landscape, wilderness. Americans are very invested in this idea of wilderness, but the whole concept of wilderness, which is the unspoiled, God-given place to reinvent yourself, of course, takes no notice of the fact that it wasn't a wilderness, that the landscape had been changed profoundly by Native Americans before the white man got here. And that one of my, again, another learning, another teaching in the garden was looking at the New England landscape. That's where I was, in Connecticut, which looked to me like nature, untrammeled, was second growth forest that had been completely cut down for the iron industry in the 19th century. And then if you go back further than that, it had been completely shaped by Native Americans and the fires they set and the species they favored. But of course, to hold on to this wilderness idea, you have to erase the indigenous presence from the landscape, and that is what we did. But we had no idea how much even we as white people changed America. By the time we got to the West Coast or the Great Plains, and people saw this tumbleweed, rolling down the plains, and they thought that was a native species. It wasn't. It had come from the Ukraine, and they had carried in their boots and on their ships, and it had spread faster than the people, and so it was waiting for them when they got there. So this mythology of nature as something different and unspoiled goes really, really deep. And then you take the plants themselves. I mean, when you have a bourbon rose or a Jack Herrera cannabis variety, these plants have been changed profoundly by artificial selection. And they have information that comes from, the genus rose or the genus cannabis. And then they have other information that is reflecting of human values. And that was kind of the premise of Botany of Desire, that when you look at an apple, when you look at a red delicious apple, that's not exactly a product of nature. It's a product of nature plus culture. And it's a mirror in which we can see ourselves, because our desires have been folded into the evolution of that species. The fact that we love apples as red as possible, for example, and as sweet as possible. Those are human values that the plants take on through the process of domestication. For them, it's a winning strategy. If they can appeal to our desires, if they can figure out and unlock our aesthetics, the kind of mind change we want, the kind of beauty we want, you can look at a domesticated plant, and in the same way, you can look at a flower and have a pretty precise record of what a bee finds attractive, because that's what the flower evolved to do, to attract bees. Well, the same is true with apples or squash or grapes or any of the crops that we've domesticated. They reflect our values, as transmuted by nature, by these species. So it's very mixed, and I love that. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. I think the desire to separate out nature and culture is kind of deadening, and besides being completely wrong-headed.
Yes, I agree.
And that goes for entheogens too. Many of them have evolved. The cannabis plants or the hemp plants that had the most THC were the ones that had their seeds carried around the world. And same with, coffee. And here is this plant that, had this little bit of habitat in East Africa, in Ethiopia. And then when it figured out how to appeal to the human desire for stimulation and focus and all the things that caffeine gives us, it explodes and becomes a plant that circles the globe as it does now, and becomes one of the most valuable crops that there is. And we go to enormous lengths to benefit that plant. So I really think the plants are in charge of this relationship in many ways.
I love this this mutual relationship, and this idea of maybe even who's a parasite of who, and who is using who.
Well, who's
we
the
are
actor?
mutually using each other and mutually benefiting each other. I just want to make one remark. Then when you say we think of nature, I think we in the West, but yeah, traditionally Amerindian populations don't separate things
Absolutely
like that.
Right.
And
Right.
it's us that I met this I'm not sure now if it's an indigenous elder or Marshall Silence or an anthropologist that said something like, we all believe that we come from, in the West, people think they come from animals, and like we have this evolution, that there is this biological evolution by which we understand we became humans, but traditionally everything is human. And this idea that in the past everybody was human, and now we're different plants or rocks or rivers or the sky or a banana, a pig, a human, everything is essentially alive, has culture, has agency, has intentionality, and we have different bodies, but we share a common nature, a common culture, a common spirit, a common humanhood. It's us that makes this kind of separation, that we are on the top hierarchy, and we are so.
And also that we're not that we're not the only subjects. We're not the only persons. We kind of assume that we are subjects, and everything else in nature is an object. That is and when I say we, I mean people in the West, obviously, because that is not the native view of things. But that's a very powerful idea, because it allows you to objectify nature, and the things you can objectify you are free to manipulate. If you have a more animistic sense, and you see the sovereignty, or recognize the sovereignty of other species and the interests of other species, that's a check on your ability to change them, to kill them, to eat them, all these things. So that's been a very powerful idea in the West. It has given us the civilization we have, but it's based on a false idea. And it's also led to enormous environmental destruction. And so appreciating the subjecthood of other species is, I think, a first step toward righting our relationship to the natural world. And that's a project that I'm, engaged in. I don't think I'm an animist. Someone challenged me on this at a recent event and said, "Why aren't you an animist?" And I'm not sure the rocks are alive. And I don't know how you would go about proving an animist view of the world. And But I do believe in the subjecthood of other living species and the fact that they have their own interest, their own agency, their own, and I'm speaking metaphorically, point of view.
Well, for that, I invite you to watch some more Chacruna events and hang out more
Yeah.
with us. And your next book, perhaps you're going to go all the way that way.
Go
But
full
anyway,
animist.
well, I say to take more seriously native claims and to, really epistemologically, ontologically take that seriously. And what would it imply in terms of reclassifying all these paradigms? I confess I felt a little divided because there's so many things I wanted to ask you. And, one side of me wanted to focus on the book and the other wanted to focus on the juicy politics of the psychedelic field. Since you don't get Michael Pollan on your screen every day, I want to move more to these general questions about the field and transition to the topic of the drug war and the politics and the psychedelic renaissance, the new boom we're at. I do think it connects because I do think that the drug war lends itself to a lot of is based on a lot of these paradigms. It's certainly a war on species, like it's a anthropocentric war where we have the right to kill and eliminate certain species. Think of, like, for example, the attempts to eradicate coca leaf. No, and it's also anthropocentric in the sense that we think that one state is the more legitimate one, the rational wake up state, and all these other states
One state of consciousness, you mean?
Yes, like being on woken up and in your rational mode is the top sense and state, and all this other dreaming or illness or inebriation or bodily alterations, they're all kind of less important. And I want to touch on this topic. I remember you wrote a first open ed that didn't land so well with some members of the psychedelic community, among them me, which was like, hey, let's take it easy with the decriminalization.
Well, no, it was let's take it easy with the legalization. I made that distinction in that piece. I think it was kind of oversold by the headline, the slow down piece. But I made a distinction between legalization, which I don't think we're ready for, and decriminalization, which I completely support.
Okay, well, we wrote a critique to that piece of yours, which made me insecure because you're kind of renowned. But I really appreciated that you kept on being my friend after that and tweeting our stuff. So I think this is a good example on how having different ideas doesn't make people, hate each other or enemies, and there's a space for a cordial intellectual disagreement.
I couldn't agree more.
Yes, and I think that's why also I opened up saying that I do think you were a true gentleman, and I think a lot of critiques made to you were unfair. So from the field of psychedelics, and that's maybe others were legit. We can talk about them all, but I do feel that I don't know if it's my wishful thinking or my bias because I wrote that piece, that critique. I do feel that you did evolve your thinking in the. So I don't know. It's okay to admit.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I evolved and the culture evolved. I mean, I think that things are moving very quickly, and that I'm astonished at how quickly decriminalization is moving across the country. My concern, I mean, the most current statement of my point of view on this is an article I published last summer in the New York Times Magazine about I forget what it was called, but it was something about are we ready to legalize drugs?
Yes, that's the way I said that. I thought your mind evolved because there was that first one that we wrote the critique, and then there's a recent one that I think is pretty different. Maybe the Chacruna team could help us out and put.
Yeah, if you could find that link. It was New York Times Magazine, and it was in sometime this summer. In July, probably. I'm sorry, I don't have the headline handy. But you could find it on michaelpollan.com too. I have all my articles are there for free. My concern is that there's a lot of interest in just kind of treating psychedelics the way we've treated cannabis, and that there are a lot of people, especially in the cannabis business, who want to see psilocybin in the dispensaries right next to your cannabis buds and vapes and all that kind of stuff. I think every drug, and we'll call them that for this purpose, since we're talking about the drug war, needs to have its own special status and container. I think that the drugs, the only thing they have in common, yes, how should we do drugs now? That's the title of the piece. Thank you for posting that. The only reason that we lump them together is they're all illegal. They're so fundamentally different in their effects, in their risks, in the context in which they should be used or can be used, that to make them all legal or make them all illegal is not, makes no sense. And I think that psychedelics need their own container. I think that psilocybin and LSD are more consequential experiences than cannabis. I think as a culture, we have a fair amount of experience using cannabis in a casual way. The sky has not fallen. But I also am troubled by the idea, and maybe I just need to get used to it, that if we legalize, we have to remember, if we legalize something, we are commercializing it. And I just not ready to see what, late capitalism would do with psilocybin when it started promoting it to the public. You live in the Bay Area, there are billboards all over the place that promise delivery of cannabis to your door within 2 hours. Just call this number or text this number. The idea that you would do the same with psychedelics is troubling to me. That said, I don't think anyone should go to jail for possession or use or sharing of any drug. But I think it's a really important cultural project to devise the safe container for these more powerful substances. And how do we do that? Well, there's a couple different containers. We have the medical container, and we're on the path for FDA approval of psilocybin and MDMA, it appears. And they will devise a container that, you take it in this kind of environment. There's always a guide or two guides, a man and a woman. You're prepared in this way. You're integrated in this way. That's a container. And then we have this religious container that the Native American Church has, that the ayahuasca churches have, and there'll be other ones too, which is you take it in the sacramental way, in groups with other people. And then there's the big middle. Like, what do you do with people who don't have a mental health diagnosis, are not perhaps spiritual, but have other perfectly good reasons for taking psychedelics, personal growth, a curiosity to explore their own minds, all these kind of reasons. And I think they should have access. But exactly in what container? One of the reasons I wanted to look at the Native American Church in this new book is to see what we could learn from the way traditional cultures use psychedelic substances. Without kind of imitating a culture that's not our culture and culturally appropriating what they're doing, there's some fundamental underlying regulations or rules that seems to cut across many different cultures in their use of these drugs, which is there's usually an elder involved. They're usually used in a group setting. They're never used casually. There's always a clear intention that's often articulated. And they're surrounded by ritual. And those 5 things, I'm not sure I'm counting correctly, 4 or 5 things, seem to me very useful guides to us as we're figuring out how to use psychedelics at high doses. I'm not talking about the museum dose of psilocybin or microdoses. Doesn't apply. So that's the job before us. And I think we should work on that container before we, let capitalism at it.
Okay, I want to ask your permission to let me speak for a few seconds. I do have so many opinions.
You want me to stick around?
Yeah, you can. I'll tell you, but I do feel that I wanted to say a few things that I didn't have the chance in the previous questions. But anyway, I don't think it's the culture that changed so much. I think it's like you caught up on what people were already saying and knew beforehand. I do think it's going fast, but all of us that are activists have always been advocating for, the importance of decriminalization. I remember talking to you about this in that event of Mike Margolis a few years back. That's the main point of activists, that just simply the drug war doesn't do it. I think there is a confusion between the commercialization and the decriminalization or legalization. It's like two sets of different questions. I was on a debate with Rick recently with Jeff Sabat. He's like a main anti-drug czar, and he kept on attacking decriminalization because he said, we don't want like commercial super tobacco, super psychedelics now. We don't want big pharma into it. So I thought that was very disingenuous of him, because I don't think he was really caring for people of color, or the stigma or the consequences of drug war on minorities, but rather he was a classic prohibitionist that just didn't want to change the status quo. So I think that not wanting commercialization and big pharma, or propaganda and marketing and aggressive ways of disseminating things is something of a different order than understanding the damages of the drug war. And decriminalization is really not enough, because it still leaves a lot of holes, and there's still a lot of areas that would be illegal, and it's not fully protection. So I think that's a good question. We can talk more. That is one point I wanted to say. And the other point is also a little, respectful provocation. But don't you think that perhaps you're also disregarding a little bit of Americans' own legitimate history with these things? I think you do well by not fetishizing South American indigenous people and looking to the Native American church. So I think a lot of people like to say, oh, look, they have these shamans in South America and ayahuasca, they do so well and it's beautiful. Or, the Wixárika in Mexico and Huichol and peyote, and you look to their own tradition in the US, that's good. But you do seem to disregard another set of traditions that are legitimate of this culture. And I think that I, as a foreigner, see this more clearly, because I think Americans don't see so often, what's so fascinating and American, that things that are typical from here. And with this, I want to talk about two things. It's the counterculture movement, and also the movement of festivals, and this whole culture around taking substances in festivals. And so my questions, and leave the commercialization part for later. We can come back to that. I have another question about that. One, don't you think it's a little bit of a prejudiced view to entirely disregard the counterculture movement, to say that's just a big irresponsible, getting out of the track things? And two, what about Burning Man and all the culture of festivals and underground circles and use that are legit to this territory, that is not Native American, and that is not just, irresponsible? Don't you think that has a role as well?
I think there are lots of people in America and other places that have had really valuable psychedelic experiences without any kind of guardrails. Yeah. But I also think there are people who get in trouble. I mean, the Zendo Project is all about that. I mean, that there are risks, psychological risks attached to these substances, and we have to take account of that. And within a festival, you can have your Trip Tent, you can have your Zendo Project, and in a way, you are creating a container, right, in the festival. And but what about out in in everyday life? So you need to put in place that kind of harm reduction. So yeah, I mean, that is a tradition. I'm using psychedelics in festivals. It's not one I know much about. I've never been to Burning Man. So it's not part of my experience.
Well, maybe that's a new talk. Who knows? Maybe Michael Pollan. That's the problem. Maybe you come with a new book. I invite you to look at this, contemporary phenomena. I am particularly fascinated. I've never gone to Burning Man. I don't think I have a wardrobe that is good enough. But anyway,
I thought you didn't need any wardrobe.
Well, they say you don't, but that's all the hipsters that have the cool wardrobes, and so that's okay by them. Anyway, there's a lot of, I was in the San Francisco, California Museum. I got a membership for my birthday. I love that place, the California Academy of Arts and Science
Yeah.
in the Golden Gate. And they had one day that was about mushrooms. And there was all this entire day. And, there was a part that was the medicinal thing. There was a part that was the nutritious one. And there were also the psychedelic aspect, some in one hallway, there were all the zines and all these people that have all this, circles and traditions and cultures around psilocybin that for me as a Brazilian is fascinating. Like, we don't have that in that form in Brazil. And there's a whole culture around it. There's underground presses, and there's, people that hunt mushrooms together, exchange recipes. And yeah, so just wanted to talk to you. I invite you to look with your critical ethnographic lenses that you have.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a very good point. I mean, I think we do have a culture of psychedelics. It's very much of a 1960s culture, although it's been updated through Burning Man in a certain way. And it seems to be, I don't know that much about it, but it seems to be sustainable. And with the addition of the Zendo culture, it sounds like that is dealing adequately with the problems that crop up.
The Zendo is like, if you talk about love and you go to a divorce lawyer and he's going to tell you, don't get married. That's going to be this and this and this and this problem. But there's all those people that got married and didn't go to the divorce lawyer. I mean, they're getting the problems, and that's a minority compared to the non-problems. Anyway, that's my, I am an activist. I have highly biased and highly involved, but
well, how do you think legalization should work?
Well, that's, I think, a good point, and nothing like a counter question for.
I think
because I don't know, frankly. I think
legalization solves one problem, but it opens up another problem, which is, how do you do it? Who has the right to sell these? Do they advertise them? Who can take? Who cannot? Is it like 18? Is it 21? Are there any regulations attached? Is there, do you regulate the potency of it? Do you, we have lots of things that are legal, but there are a set of rules that come with them. Alcohol is an example. And so I just think we should give a lot of thought to that before we legalize it.
I think we should give a lot of thought, but we also have to remember that this is in the end, there is some white privilege to this, concerns, because like people of color that have been massively incarcerated and persecuted and stigmatized and treated like guinea pigs in scientific experiments. And if you ask those minorities, do you think there's advantages to criminalization or only partial, liberties? I think people would be more radical and adamant, because, I mean, for anything, we could still go to jail federally for using plants, for sharing our interests. And me as an immigrant, and I'm so proud that I got my American citizenship, I was asked in the interview if I took drugs. And I mean, these things are still high taboo.
Yeah, look, you won't find a stronger critic of the drug war. But I think the issue is, how do you unwind it? And look, focusing exclusively on psychedelics is, there's a lot of white privilege there, right? I mean, psychedelics are not a real target of the drug war the way other drugs are, and today. And white people incur very low risks using psychedelics. Maybe if you're a chemist, it's another question, or you're a dealer, it's another question. But for using, and one of the reasons the psychedelic world is as white as it is because getting involved with drugs is riskier if you're Black. You're much more likely to end up in jail. And there's a whole other, there are cultural reasons as well. So I think focusing exclusively on, legalizing or decriminalizing psychedelics is a question. And I think we should be aware of the what we're leaving out. We're not really solving the drug war problem by taking care of psychedelics.
I agree with you, and I also think it's in Chacruna we're going to launch a guide about religious freedom. I'm very enthusiastic of this path of under the current legislations protecting the religious freedom rights. I think there's also a lot of gray area there that could be more explored. Frequently, now we just have a few exemptions for religious freedom. I think there's could be many more. So that's one thing that I think we could still.
And I think there will be. I think that is one of the promising futures. That I think that this particular Supreme Court, which is so right-wing and so radical in its views of religious freedom, that as more psychedelic churches are formed and prosecuted, this Supreme Court will have a lot of trouble closing them down. This is a Supreme Court that believes that corporations have religious freedom. And if they don't want to, serve gay people or whatever, if it's opposed or pay for abortions or even birth control, they don't have to. So it seems to me that psychedelic churches are going to be something of an exploding cigar when they get to the Supreme Court, and we will have more of them. And I think that that's a healthy thing. I think we should. I think there are many people for whom psychedelics and entheogens are a sacrament, and the government shouldn't get in the way of people's ability to use it.
I think that we could have you as a continued ally to the movement, maybe putting also your eyes into this more carefully. I would love to see your Michael Pollan lens on this whole philosophical discussions about what is religion, how do you define it, what is sincerity. Can you just use one sacrament to be a religion because it has to be central, or can you use multiple sacraments?
And what if it's a chemical and not a plant?
Exactly.
Can you have a religious use or an MDMA church?
In this book that I showed, we discussed Timothy Leary's short-lived LSD church that didn't go very far. Anyway,
I think his church would stand a better chance today than it did in the 1960s with a left court. I think the right court will be friendly to this. But I could be wrong.
Move to the question soon, but since we talked about a little bit about commercialization, I just wanted to see, I want the uncensored, true heart answer to this one. How are you feeling about the current boom? I am kind of dismayed and grossed out with what's happening, but I think I'm more perhaps radical. What do you think of this million startups and all these new conferences? Really?
Well, I'm glad to know how you feel about it. I'm concerned. I think we have a gold rush mentality. I think that there is a lot of money that's going to be lost. That doesn't break my heart, but there's more capital than there are good ideas. I don't think anyone has figured out how to make money on psychedelics yet, except possibly the companies, that are going to make retreat centers in the Caribbean or Mexico, or clinics and fancy clinics in American cities. I mean, those guys probably will make some money, but as a drug, for sale, I don't think anyone has a clue how to do it. So I think there'll be a big shakeout. I think a lot of companies will crash and burn. That's the destructive nature of the creative destruction of capitalism. I think that the enthusiasm for psychedelics is so great that it is drawing all sorts of people into the marketplace, both for underground and overground businesses, and that some people are going to get hurt. There are a lot of unqualified guides out there, and more all the time. There's a lot of profiteering. People are charging, tremendous amounts for psychedelic therapy. So it's just, it's becoming that shit show that anything popular in America becomes. I don't think we should be too surprised, but it's discouraging. On the plus side, these substances have the potential to relieve a great deal of mental suffering. And I've seen that happen. I've seen that happen in people close to me. I've read it in other accounts. I've interviewed people. And I hope we don't lose track of that, because sooner or later, when there is the kind of what we call irrational exuberance around anything, there's usually a crash, economically, culturally. And the form of the crash in psychedelics will be a backlash. these substances that were so magical and good will be regarded as, evil and dangerous. And I think that's a shame. I mean, the pendulum swings violently in this country. And so, this is something I argue with Rick Doblin about a lot, who's not too worried about a backlash, or at least last time I talked to him about it wasn't. Maybe he feels differently now. That, the culture is grown up compared to the 60s. And it is true that in the 60s, there were so many people afraid of psychedelics because they didn't know about them and they hadn't ever taken them. And now you have people in charge in our culture who are familiar with psychedelics. But the tendency of the media, and I know this having been a writer for many years and an editor for many years before that, it's going to be, at a certain point, it's going to be impossible to sell a positive article about psychedelics. All editors will want to hear is a negative article. And so you'll get a flood of negative articles. It's exactly what happened in 1965, where we went from a press about psychedelics that was unreasonably positive and completely acritical, non-critical, to one that was highly critical and could only tell horror stories. And there are horror stories to tell. The question is, do they get airtime? And I think they will get airtime. And that could damage things and make it harder for people to get access to something that could really help them.
Well, this is, we're not going to be able to solve everything here. I had other things about Berkeley and journalism, but yeah, I also argue with Rick Doblin. I also have part-time job in MAPS, so he's my boss, and he appreciates that I challenge him, and that's part of our friendship. I personally, I don't know, maybe, you guys are older and you are American, but I think this whole, the counterculture created all this damage. I think the counterculture was wonderful. I am not so sorry that a few scientists got backlash and there was, it created a revolution, and, it changed the world, and women could do all these things and gay people could do all these things. And
you're pushing on an open door, Bia. On balance, I think what happened in the 60s was very positive. It was the women's movement. It was the beginning of gay rights, civil rights. Don't forget that. And the environmental movement. These are all great achievements. But as often happens in America, as we're seeing right now, great progress begets a violent backlash. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't go for the progress, but you should understand when the world turns against you. And, we're dealing with the progress to the backlash to electing a black man in 2008. We're still dealing with that.
Right. But should we have not elected a black man?
I just said the opposite. I said, you still have to make the progress you can. And then you have to arm yourself against the inevitable backlash. So I just see this is how progress comes to America. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I think we may be about to have 1 step back on psychedelics.
I think, we say in Portuguese, the dogs will bark and the caravan will pass. Do you say that in English too?
No, not me. I don't know what it means.
Do you understand? It's like the caravan is passing. You can have dogs barking, but
it can't be stopped. Right. Yeah.
It's gonna go, and so they
I hope you're right.
And yes, I just meant that this thing of, look at what happened in the 60s and all the backlash, I feel undermines everything good that happened in the 60s.
I agree. And look, and the drug war was
not. People say that a lot in the scientists. They love to say that, and I think it puts out of proportion.
I think it's a story. I think it's a myth. I think that it's very important for the scientists to distance themselves from the counterculture. I think it's a political move, and it's an understandable one, but I think it is built on a myth. The drug war was. I talk about this in This Is Your Mind on Plants. That President Nixon felt threatened by the counterculture. He said he said this to John Ehrlichman. I quote him in the book that the Nixon administration's biggest enemies were the hippies and the blacks, and they figured out that a drug war was the way to disrupt both communities, as indeed it was. It gave them power to go into these communities and mess with them and discredit them. And So that's really, and Nixon was concerned about psychedelics because American boys were not doing what American boys usually do, which is go fight wars when you tell them to. They were refusing to, and he thought LSD was the reason, and he might well have been right. I mean, I tell the story in How to Change Your Mind.
All right, I want to ask everybody to post their questions in the Ask a Button question. And then I want to say to everybody that I wanted to show Michael the questions I wanted to make to him before, and he declined, which I thought that was cool because it's more like authentic, on the move.
It's true. I did not know what Bia was going to do. The questions were in a sealed envelope controlled by an accounting firm in San Francisco, and I was not allowed to see them till just now.
You didn't want to see them.
I did not want to see them. It's much more fun when you don't know what's going on.
Yes, exactly. So
otherwise I get sleepy.
Yes, I think that's that speaks to your nature. You're open, you're curious, you're a journalist, you're an investigator.
And I don't have all the answers, and I'm happy to say that.
Yes, and people have criticized you. Oh, he didn't do this, he didn't do that, and okay, nobody can do everything, and try to write a book, try to write a footnote, try to put italics and references in all your writing. So I feel there's a lot of critique that I think is really unfair, and everybody that is a celebrity gets a lot of flack. And so my experience of Michael Pollan is of a person that is completely open, and I wanted to register that for our appreciation.
Yeah, and I understand that. Look, I mean, I'm very fortunate in that I have a powerful microphone, and but I'm going to use it to say what I think, and other people don't have the same access to that microphone. And so I get that. I get that would be troubling to people, but I appreciate when people like you, educate me or try to educate me. And it deepens my work. And, one of the reasons I started writing about indigenous use of psychedelics is I was hearing the criticism of, How to Change Your Mind, that I'd overlooked a very big part of the psychedelic story. And so, I'm still learning. I mean, I wrote, How to Change Your Mind is an amateur's book, right? It's a novice's book. And the education goes on.
Yes, it's an ongoing school. We see ourselves in Chacruna as part of a school. We are part of a movement. We're together, co-students learning. The plants are our teachers. And I think talking about people, talking about territories, talking about traditions enriches the way we understand this. I would make my last question to say, do you have any comment about some self-reflexive comment about your own role in the psychedelic movement being where it is now? Like when you're a backpacker and find this paradisiacal beach, and then years later that you come and they're selling hot dogs and coke on the beach. Well, I don't know. We in Brazil, we're always trying to find the new beaches, and until it's not discovered, and then these horrible corporations take over. In a way, you were talking about something that was kind of more secretive and underground, not entirely, but much more. And perhaps paradoxically, you also help to bring all this mainstream into psychedelics, which is also taking psychedelics into weird spots. It's not your fault. You're not alone, but maybe you did play a role. Do you have anything?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what role I played. I mean, as a writer, we don't remake the world. We have some, we're like surfers. We have some sense when there's a wave building and it's a good, that there's something to ride here. I don't see myself as a visionary. I don't think many journalists are. Journalists who are true visionaries, nobody understands a word they're saying. Nobody reads them because it's too far ahead. Good journalists can see around a corner, one corner. I think there was a cultural wave building, and maybe my work accelerated that. I think the fact that I was writing as somebody older, whiter, who was new to psychedelics and had written in a way about health and had some cultural authority speaking on questions of health from my work on food, that legitimized the subject. And that made it easier, perhaps, for people who were nervous about psychedelics to get involved, to invest their money, to try it. I mean, and, but would it have happened if I didn't write my book? Yeah, but maybe a little bit later. I think it was bound to happen. I think the culture was looking for something. I think that mental health challenges were so serious that there was an openness to looking at alternative ways to treat mental health. There was a lot of suffering and a lot of desperation. I was very struck by the reaction of the psychiatric establishment or the therapy establishment, that I thought that they would really fight back and be very critical of the book and of psychedelics. And in fact, they have greeted it with more or less open arms. And the reason is that they know their tools are just really lousy and they need new tools. So, I think a book like mine, might speed along developments, but I don't think it creates developments that would not have happened. And remember, what got me interested is what's getting the culture interested. I just amplified these scientific findings, which are extraordinary. I mean, the work done at Hopkins and NYU and, we were learning, and Imperial College in London. Without those studies and those results, which I may have amplified, I don't think you have the kind of interest you do. So, I think we have to give the scientists credit for driving what's happening.
All right, Michael Pollan, writer, author, speaker, journalist, researcher, gardener, and surfer, I learned now.
I've never surfed in my life. But
surfing the wave of what's in the cultural mentalities, changing the mentality.
Let's take a question.
All right. I'm going to read here. People, you can also vote on the questions and see which ones you want to be taken first. Are you concerned about the current mainstreaming and commodification of psychedelics? We kind of talked about that, but
yeah,
there's a second part.
What
do you think needs to happen to ensure the psychedelic renaissance move forward in the most healthy and positive way?
Well, I think that, we have to ensure that, assuming that these phase 3 trials come out the way everybody hopes they will, and that these medicines prove themselves valuable in treating depression or trauma, that access is democratic, and that people don't have to pay more than they can afford to have access to this. I think that's really important. I am concerned about the efforts to tie up the intellectual property in psychedelics. And there is a kind of land grab or enclosure mentality going on. I understand this. This is what pharmaceutical companies do. Although finally, I'm kind of skeptical that you can control something like psilocybin. I think that, the mushrooms are not that hard to grow. They grow in nature, and no one's going to be able to stop that. But yeah, I am concerned about commodification. But I guess I see it as inevitable. I'm very interested in what MAPS is trying to do, though. I mean, they are trying to bring a drug to market on a nonprofit basis or a public benefit corporation basis. I don't know that this has ever been done before. And this proposes, there are two great experiments underway. That's one, the attempt to bring MDMA to market in a whole new way and use the profits, feed them right back into research. Will that work? We'll see. And the other great experiment is Oregon, right? Which is an attempt to create the kind of container that, I've been talking about, where you'll have guides who are trained and licensed, and you'll have growers of psilocybin that are trained and licensed, and that people who don't have a psychiatric diagnosis will be able to seek psilocybin treatment. Well, treatment or therapy is not the wrong word, but the experience. And whether that experiment works or crashes and burns, I think is really an interesting question. And I'm keenly interested in what's happening there, because it's an attempt to address some of the problems with a completely unregulated underground market.
As a male as a white male researcher moving forward, how will you use your privilege to advocate for indigenous worldviews in the psychedelic renaissance?
Read This Is Your Mind on Plants. I mean, you know, I dealt with those issues in the chapter on mescaline. And so there's a very live question about who should have access to peyote. Peyote is in short supply. It grows very slowly. It only grows in one area in the whole world. It's vitally important to Native Americans. And I had a very interesting experience interviewing Native Americans about this, many of whom didn't want to talk to a white American about what happens in their ceremonies and the value of peyote. And their fear was that by my writing about that, it would create you know, greater interest in people like me seeking peyote. So I ended up making very clear that even though I had had the opportunity or invitations to use peyote in ceremony, the most responsible thing I could do as a white person with a microphone was to say no and not to take it. And that realizing that peyote should be left to Native Americans. And so I got to that point of view because I was educated by a great many Native Americans. And so I've grappled with exactly the questions that the questioner is asking for and written about them as well as I could in This Is Your Mind on Plants.
Yeah, and sorry that we didn't talk much about mescaline. It was also my fault not to put a question about that. I do think that's one of the more interesting aspects of this book. And I invite people to read in the chat Native American statements that we published in Chacruna about this topic. And that's very controversial with the decrim nature that has refused to accept the Native American positions on this. The underground psychedelic world has recently been in the spotlight in light of abuse allegations against major influencer in the field. It seems like this has big implications for the future of both above ground and underground psychedelic therapeutic work. Could you comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very troubled by what we're learning, and that I'm following the story, and they're very troubling allegations that have been made. I think a couple things to keep in mind. I mean, one is that therapy abuse, and this involves sexual abuse of patients by therapists, alleged, is a problem in all forms of therapy. This has a long history in conventional therapy. The reasons for it are that there is this power imbalance between the therapist and the patient very often. Usually there's a transference where the patient develops strong feelings, sometimes of idolatry of the therapist, that the therapist can take advantage of. So this basic risk, which is present in all therapeutic relationships, is exacerbated with psychedelics. In the case of MDMA, you have a drug that increases the intensity or the speed of transference, creates bonds of trust and love even between the patient and the therapist. So it creates an enormous vulnerability for the patient. And then in the case of conventional psychedelics like psilocybin, the patient is incapacitated to some extent, or can be. So the problem comes when you have an underground system, in that there is no professional body or licensing body that can sanction people who violate the ethics of the field. And the interesting question is, can an underground system of guides have an ethical code and a way to sanction people who violate it? And I don't know the answer to that. But it's one of the reasons in favor of finding a way to decriminalize or legalize underground therapy, to remove this vulnerability, to create a situation, to the extent you can, to create a situation where there can be some recourse for people who are harmed. I would also point out, though, that there is vulnerability on both sides when you're underground. And that is that any aggrieved patient has an enormous weapon to wield, which is turning in a therapist who's violating the law. And so the vulnerability goes both ways. And it's just kind of the perversion of having an underground system. And it's a great risk. And I think there will be more cases of it. And I think we're going to, and I worry that it's this kind of event that will feed into the kind of backlash I'm talking about, and discredit, because there's so many ethical, moral people doing underground therapy, and that they will all be tarred with the same brush. And I think that would be a shame.
Thank you. I want to invite everybody to look at the links that we posted in the chat. So we're talking here implicitly about accusations that were made against Françoise Buzard and Aaron, her husband. There has been 2 articles published in the media, and some other opinions, things have been circulating. I also want to invite everybody to come. We're doing an event on December 8th about transgressions and sexual abuse in therapy with activists and therapists. So I want to invite people to come. And just want to say that's the problem of criminalization is also that one, that it doesn't create a setting that is so good for people to come forward. But yeah, to remind that sexual abuse and other problems occur above ground as well, with regular therapists, with and without psychedelics. So anyway, that's a big question, but I think it's an important one. I'm going to move to the next one. You can always vote the questions, don't forget that. There has been a definite shift in the US legal landscape regarding plant medicine and psychedelics. Can you shed any light on the private conversations you've been part of with lawmakers and regulators, and what you see happening in regards to decriminalization, legalization, and accessibility to these medicines?
Well, I have not had those conversations. I've talked to a couple Congress people who are friendly to the movement, and have asked me if I could think of any legislative ideas that would help the movement. AOC has put forward a bill to encourage research, I guess, on psychedelics. The NIH, which funds most medical research, has until recently not supported psychedelic research, but they are now. So I haven't had a good idea of something that needs to happen, but I haven't been consulted on what's happening in California, where there is Senate Bill 218 that would legalize psychedelics. I've had 1 or 2 conversations with people involved in Oregon, I guess, and these things are moving quickly, and the Oregon situation is an interesting one, because they're really trying to set it up with proper guardrails, taking account of the kind of issues of creating a licensing body for guides, which presumably means there would be a place people could complain to if they had a problem, and there could be sanctions if they were called for. And so even before this current concern, they were aware of it and trying to create a system that would address it. So I hope that other efforts to legalize psilocybin, such as the one in California, which really is a legalization bill, will take account of what's happening now and try to address it. That would be my advice if I were talking to them.
Yeah, excellent. This is what is cool. We're seeing history happening. I mean, these things are we are witness, co-creators and witness.
It's a amazing moment. I mean, to see what's happening. Decisions are being made now. They're going to have very long-standing effects. But the idea that I'm in these councils, that are making these decisions is exaggerating my role, I think.
Well, it's true. It's what I said about celebrities, that sometimes people think that they have superpowers. They're more powerful than they are, in fact. So here you have Michael Pollan saying, no, in fact, I don't have this secret conversation.
Yeah, Senator Wiener hasn't called me.
Didn't ask your opinion. Call him. Hey, Mike, what's
Nope.
up?
Nope.
All right. We're coming here really to an end. I wanted to know. I asked you this back then, and you said you didn't know. I don't know if you don't know or you don't want to share. But what's next? Are you still cooking it up, or it's secret, and you're gonna give it to us when you have it more clear? Is it the Berkeley
Yeah,
thing?
I'm not ready to talk about new work. It's a long, slow process, and it changes so much that I could say one thing and it'll be very different by the time it comes out. But I will be writing another book at some point. I'm obliged to contractually. I've been working on a Netflix series on psychedelics that will hopefully be out sometime next year, based on how to change your mind. And I'm very excited about that. Books only reach a certain sliver of the public, and television has the potential to reach a lot more people. And but we're working hard to figure out a way to tell the story that's compelling and not sensational. And the emphasis is very much on therapy, but not entirely, because there is going to be an episode on mescaline that will look closely at the Native American church. So it's actually a mix of How to Change Your Mind and This Is Your Mind on Plants. It's going to draw from both books.
And to sum up, who would be like a kind of reference for you, or who's like somebody that you admire in this movement, either author or researcher or writer or journalist, or a few?
Oh, there's so many. I do have great admiration for the pioneering researchers. I mean, they really, took reputational risks and with their careers. People like Roland Griffith, I think is a hero of this movement, and he's been a great teacher of mine, not only on psychedelics, but as it turns out, he's the world's leading expert on caffeine, which is one of the drugs I looked at in This Is Your Mind on Plants. I've learned a lot from Julie Holland, the psychiatrist in New York, Matt Johnson, also at Hopkins, Tony Bosis at NYU. Robin Carhart Harris has been a terrific teacher of mine on the neuroscience of psychedelics. I've learned from you. Just read the acknowledgments in the book. As so many teachers, I didn't know anything about this subject when I started. I was starting from scratch. So I'm very grateful to everyone who took the time to educate me. And on the Native American Church, Sandra Ironrope, Dawn Davis, Steve Benally. I mean, these are members of the Native American Church, were indispensable teachers. And Cody Swift. And I've been fortunate in my teachers.
Okay, we're really going to come to an end here. I want to ask you, perhaps indulge me, and how do you see the role of Chacruna as we move forward? What do you want to tell our team, and which directions do you think we should invest, or how do you see our growth, or how has it been to follow that Bia that you met?
Yeah,
backpacking almost.
Well, I'm kind of amazed that what you've managed to build in these few years, and that Chacruna does fill a hole. And Josh expressed it really well about building the bridge between this, what most people know about this scientific enterprise, medical enterprise, and a more traditional indigenous approach, and what the two can teach each other. That exchange, I think, is really valuable. And also, Chacruna is doing a lot of public education with events like this, and I think that's really important too. There are not a lot of organizations who are doing it.
Thank you. We can cut and paste for our promotional clips, because Michael Pollan said maybe we got the funders to believe that. We have been struggling with that, as you know. It's culture awareness, building this ethos and talking about this kind of thing. Why does it matter? So we like to say plant matters, culture matters, minorities matter.
And I think that there's increasing awareness of the importance of traditional cultures and what they have to teach us about psychedelics. I mean, Part of the problem with psychedelics in the 60s, as wonderful as it was in many other ways, is that we were too arrogant, I think. We treated these drugs as new and complete novelties that we would figure out how to use. There was this research period all through the 50s. What is this good for? And there was no attention to the fact that there were thousands of years of human experience that had a lot of valuable lessons. And those were discarded or just ignored or not even known about for the most part. There were a couple exceptions. And Gordon Wasson, even though he brought magic mushrooms from a traditional culture, he didn't bring the culture with it. And he, in fact, changed what they were. He wanted them to be sacramental, but in fact, they were being used for divination and medicine. So he distorted that. Anyway, I think that arrogance that the West could figure out what these things were good for and how best to use them is understood now as arrogance, and that there is wisdom that's been attached to these substances, and that, with due regard for the dangers of cultural appropriation, there are ways, I think, that we can learn and avoid making mistakes by looking at traditional cultures. And Chacruna is one of the ways that that's happening.
Thank you, Michael Pollan. I'm going to call you Surfer from now on. No, just kidding.
Okay, you do that. Well, I love your beach metaphor. It went with the, wrecking the beautiful beaches of Brazil. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's sad. It's happening always. But yeah, thank you again for your.
My pleasure, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure talking to you, Bia, as usual.
Yes, your lifetime career from Botany of Desire to this book and everything you do for this movement, and all the tweets you've done that I asked, and everybody that you talk to, which I know is huge. You get dozens of emails, I know. So thank you for everything you do. I do consider a privilege to talk to you and to be related to you, and still want to visit you when I'm really rich and go back in maybe 10 years when Chacruna is very established. I'm going to sit and watch that bridge view and say, look, I made it in America. I'm still not there, but anyway.
I look forward. I'll come over to your bridge view.
All right. We'll bring
Bye,
back.
Everybody.
Thank you so much, Emily. Your few last words, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody. I don't know if. All right, Emily.
Yes.
From here.
We'll take 2 on this one. Thanks, Bia. Hopefully my video doesn't cut out again. I apologize for technical difficulties, but just another beautiful and gentle reminder from the universe that sometimes we just don't have control, and that's okay. Thank you so much, Michael and Bia. That went way too fast. I could have listened to you all talk about this for all day, and having the picture in my mind of Michael and Bia at Burning Man was awesome. So thank you all so much. Thank you for everyone. Really enjoyed all the conversation in the chat. I read all of your posts and loved the debate and discussion. It's just really beautiful, and it's an honor to be a part of this community and to be able to be involved in these discussions. If you all would like to access today's recording, it will be available immediately after we close off for today, and it'll be available at that Crowdcast link, and you can access all of our past recordings as well. Really encourage you all to check out Michael's new book, This Is Your Mind on Plants. Will be downloading the Audible version shortly because I believe Michael narrates his own books, but don't quote me on that. But looking forward to listening to that book. If you're interested in checking out some of our merch, like this Protect and Honor Sacred Plant shirt, we check out our bonfire link. We just released our Sacred Cacti shirt, another great way of supporting us and our work. Please also check out our Patreon page and become a member if you want to continue supporting our mission and to ensure that we can keep doing these great discussions, and have these wonderful speakers on here. We have our upcoming 3-day virtual conference coming up in April of 2022. Religion and Psychedelics. Our early bird tickets are on sale now. We'll post a link in the chat for that as well. So please make sure to check that out. those are always really great conference. I'm really excited actually about learning about the connection of religion and psychedelics, because this is a topic that really I'm passionate about, and I'm looking forward to that. My kids are entering the room now, so, no control. It's okay. Let me think. Yeah, next week's event, Latinos Coast to Coast. Please check that out. It'll be Wednesday, November 24th at 12 p.m. Pacific time. We also posted about our upcoming workshop that is happening December 13th on implicit bias therapy and psychedelics. So if you're interested in getting some CEUs or just about learning about this topic, please check that out. And I think that's everything. I'm so sorry that my dogs are barking. We'll make sure to send a post-event email to all the attendees and make sure to include all these links. That might not go out until tomorrow, but keep an eye out for that. And hopefully we'll see you all next week. Thank you again, Michael, so much. And apologies again for all the technical difficulties and dogs barking. We hope to see you all next week.